Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I have been in a bit of a nostalgic mood recently. I've been thinking a lot about the books that I used to read when I was younger. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that I'm leaving for university this year and I'm coming to terms with the fact that I will not be able to take a lot of books with me because I'm moving so far away. But it's made me want to revisit a lot of my old favourites, and in particular to work out what's worth keeping, what do I still need around me, and what am I happy to have just as a memory of things I used to read. And so I embarked on some quite hefty reading of two series that I liked when I was around 12 to 13-ish, probably closer to 11 for one of them actually. And those were the 13 series by Michelle Harrison and the Knife series by R.J. Anderson. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the R.J. Anderson books, because although I read the 13 series longer ago, and so I should really be starting with a video on that, I finished the Knife series yesterday, and turns out I have a lot more thoughts on it than I thought I did. So I'm going to start by filming this one, and I'll post it first, and the 13 series one can come a little bit later. But for now, I am going to be talking about these three books. God, the shininess of the covers is one of the best parts of them, but it really makes them difficult to hold on camera. This is the first book, Knife, which is then followed by Rebel, and concludes with Arrow. I have to hold them at a bit of an angle just so the light doesn't catch them so much. So I'll just give you my overall thoughts to begin with. This series is really good, and I wasn't expecting it to be. I was expecting to read it and go, cool, I can see why I liked this as a young teenager, but no way is it for me now. Like, it's good, it's nostalgic, it's fine, blah blah blah. But actually, I was shocked. I really like this, and I think it's good as well. Like, I'm not just saying that because it's something I like. I genuinely think these are good books, and I really wasn't expecting that. They're a really well fleshed out plot with really interesting characters. There are some fascinating plot points throughout. The lore and the backstory to everything is explained at the right points. It has some great moral messages, and overall it's just great fun to read. They're really engaging books, and I was surprised by that. It took me a little bit of time to get into reading them, but I think that's just because I was apprehensive based on my own judgments prior to reading them, but once I was in them, I was really enjoying myself, and I am surprised that I haven't returned to them more, actually. I should say, as a little bit of a warning for this video, there may be some spoilers. I'm going to do my best to be as unspoilery as possible, but also when talking about a series, particularly one that starts with such a narrow scope as this and ends with such a wide scope, it's kind of hard to talk about some things without invariably giving away some of the plot. So I'm endeavouring to be as spoiler-free as possible, but I might let slip some things at some points or give a little too much detail. For that, I apologise, but also these books came out in like 2009. It's been a while. I feel like it's no longer in dangerous spoiler territory. So I'm just going to go book by book and explain what each one is about and my thoughts on it, without giving away as many spoilers as possible. So, book one, Knife. Here she is. This is about a fairy named Knife, or who comes to be called Knife. She lives in an oak tree at the end of a garden where she and around 50 or so other fairies live. It is a quiet existence, fairly dull, and as she grows up, she is annoyed by the fact that they're not allowed to leave the oak because of the danger of humans outside. But through complete accident and a terrible circumstance, she ends up meeting the boy who lives in the house named Paul and striking up an unlikely friendship with him as she begins to doubt the history of the oak and the fairies who live inside it. She's unsure what parts of the history are true and what she can trust, and can she in fact trust everything she's been told by the queen who rules the oak. And so this book follows Knife as she embarks on her relationship with Paul, as she begins to question and reconsider everything she's known about the life in the oak, and as she tries to work out her own place within it. She is very young at this point, and so she is still experiencing very much a coming-of-age story, albeit the she's a fairy living in a tree. I think this book is just good. It is just a solid book. Those three plot lines of Knife's self-discovery, Knife's discovery of the Oak's history, and her relationship with Paul are really, really interesting, and they all help feed into each other in a really, really useful loop that ends up with some really, really good revelations and some shocking betrayals as well, as you would expect. But I just think it's a well-written book. It's well-balanced, the writing is solid, it's nothing special, but really you're here for the plot and the characters. Knife is a phenomenal character. I adore her. Compared to the broader scope of the other two books, this book does feel very much surface level. It is about Knife as an individual and her place within the Oak, rather than the overarching theme of fairies and community that you get in the other two books. But to be honest, I think that makes this book work well as a standalone. If you wanted to, you could just read that book and take that ending as the ending. It would work pretty well, and I just think it's a solid book. I really enjoyed rereading this one, not least because I could still remember a large majority of what happens in it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it's great. Knife is a great introduction to the world of the fairies, both her as a character and the book Knife, and it's just good. I like it. Then we get on to Rebel, the second book. This one picks up about 14 years after the end of Knife. Knife is now older, significantly, and instead the story is led by Lyndon, a fairy who was born at some point during the plotline of Knife. Without giving away too many spoilers for the first book and the revelations in it, Knife's discoveries lead them to realise that life for the fairies at the Oak isn't what it could be, and for them to explore a world where they have much more freedom, they need to make contact with other fairies, and Lyndon was raised with the intention that she would become an ambassador for the Oak, and that it would be her role to go and seek out other fairies for them to communicate with and try to find a way to improve their situation. Lyndon decides that she will leave the Oak by stowing away with a human boy named Timothy, who is staying with Paul in the house, and unfortunately they run into some trouble and they discover that the fairies in the rest of Britain are under the rule of an empress who controls them absolutely through a use of their powers, which is that each fairy has a true name, and if you know their true name, then you can control them. She has taken all the fairies' true names, and Lyndon is stuck. What can she do? So she bands together with Timothy to try and find a final community of fairies who might just have the answer, who might be able to free all the fairies and overturn the Empress's rule. Generally though, I think Rebel is my least favourite out of the three books. It just isn't as fun to me. Lyndon and Timothy aren't my favourite characters. Their plotline isn't the most interesting one, and also there's a lot of travelling in this one, and I've noticed that I am just someone who does not like travelling in books. I don't like travelling very much in real life. I am very much a home comforts kind of person, and so I think it just puts me off a little bit when there is no home base in books. There's no safe place, and you don't know when there will be. I just find it a bit off-putting and a bit difficult. I like my characters safe and comfortable, as I like to be myself. But generally I think it is a good book. It is a solid progression from what could have been a clear ending with Knife, but that it also prepares very, very nicely for the third and final book. It sets up the narrative arc, and really, you may leave Knife as the end of the story, but once you've read Rebel, you're gonna want to read Arrow. You're gonna want to read a conclusion to this. And then we have book 3, Arrow. This is the masterpiece, I think. This is the truly exceptional book that rounds off 3 books of interesting discussions, interesting characters, with very, very strong moral messages and a much more clear narrative in that way. Instead of Lyndon or Knife or even just the fairies of the Oak, we follow Rosemary, who is a fairy from the community that Timothy and Lyndon were seeking out in book 2, but who has been left behind. Timothy and Lyndon managed to raise a small group of that community to join them in saving the Oak and preparing to do battle against the Empress and her army, but Rosemary does not go with them. Her community does not believe in the cause of Lyndon and Timothy. It goes against some very, very strong traditions they have and some very, very strong views of what is right and wrong when it comes to violence, in that they believe violence is never the answer and that if you choose to do violence, you are bad. And so Rosemary is struggling a lot with the battle between her traditions and her moral traditions and what she thinks might be right. Not least because in the group of people who went off to join the Fairies of the Oak, they took a very, very useful tool with them, the thing that they think can save them, essentially, from the Empress. But it has great traditional significance to Rosemary's community, and regardless of whether she thinks it's right or wrong to support the Fairies of the Oak, she's certain that it's wrong that they took that tool, so she decides to strike out on her own to try and get it back, and hopefully reason with the members of her community who have joined the Fairies of the Oak and come to some kind of agreement. Rosemary as a protagonist is a really, really good one. I think it is an excellent show of the difference between your own personal morals and the morals imposed on you by a society, and the ways that you can begin to doubt and reconsider those when you are faced with something as large as war. I thought it was also just so brilliant the way that this final book combined all the themes about love and forgiveness and acceptance and trust and brought it into a final cumulative book with a big showdown at the end that gave some really, really good responses to everything that had been brought up across the three books. I think that it is a truly exceptional conclusion to these three books, and that Rosemary is the perfect character to bring us that ending. Her morals are strong, it is just that she is swayed by tradition, and actually I thought the moralising that Timothy makes her do when they eventually meet is some of the most fantastic parts of the book, because she has to really consider, where do her loyalties lie? How far do her loyalties stretch? And is she willing to put her morals in front of people? And I think that is an excellent thing to explore, and ironically I think it's very relevant to today's internet culture of wokeness and cancelling people who make mistakes and things like that. At what point do you put the individual after your own sense of rightness and things like that? I thought it was really, really interesting to explore, and ultimately I think it said some really, really good things. The conclusion of the story, the tool that the Fairies of the Oak, that Rosemary, Lyndon and Knife have to do battle against the Empress with, is such a well-considered thing, and I think it's just excellently done. One of the other most interesting parts of book 3, I thought, is Martin. Martin is a really interesting character, not least because you are given very little backstory for him. In fact, no backstory. However, there is a spin-off series from this with 2 books called Swift and Nomad, which I am positive Martin features in. In fact, I think he's one of the focus characters. I'm going to be rereading those as well because Martin's interesting. But to say that he's morally grey in these books is to do him a disservice. He is morally black, but you can justify a lot of his reasoning to the point where I still don't think he's morally grey, but that he is just very, very interesting to consider. We first meet Martin in Rebel. He knifes Timothy on a train and steals his wallet, but then he joins Rosemary for a part of the final book and helps her and also hinders her and does some really good things and some really bad things. And overall I think he is a really interesting character, not least because of the contrast he provides beside Rosemary as she is considering all of her different morals and persuasions and loyalties across this story. I want to talk briefly now about the characters, because the characters are what absolutely make this story. Often I think fantasy ends up fitting into roles. You get your protagonist, a love interest, a mentor character, and so the characters tend to be quite contrived and stereotyped within these roles, or rather just that they've been put in purely to fill those. But there is none of that with these stories. I'll start with Knife. Knife is my favourite character. I adore Knife. She is a fantastic character, and I think the real thing that lends itself to her success is that she is dangerously determined and curious. That is the most relatable thing about her. She is told to stop trying to find answers at numerous points in the first book, to the point where she is given a baby Lyndon to take care of because the Queen says, well, if your own duties aren't taking up enough of your time, I can give you more things to do. Stop trying to talk to humans. But she does it anyway. She's so curious, and I think of all the badass female protagonists, the ones I can relate to most are just the ones who are curious, who do things out of curiosity because they are interested. She doesn't do it to prove a point, to prove anything about herself. She does it just because she wants to know. And for book readers, I think that's a really, really relatable thing. Why else do you read if not because you are interested in what a book has to offer? I'm just so glad as well that Knife didn't get sidelined from book 1 onwards. She could have so easily been ignored in books 2 and 3. She gets her happy ending at the end of Knife, and that could be it. But no, she remains where she is, as powerful and determined and curious and absolutely unwilling to let go of her relationship with the Fairies of the Oak, and I thought that was phenomenal. However, by comparison, I think Lyndon falls a little bit short in book 2. With Knife being so passionate and determined and curious, it's no wonder that Lyndon, who is by contrast quite timid and uncertain of herself, falls a little bit flat. I don't want a female character who doubts themselves. We've got plenty of those. Lyndon she feels a bit self-inserty, if I'm honest. She reminds me so much of just the default female character who is the protagonist. And she's fine, she's nice, but really I didn't care much about her. She could have been anyone else, and I probably would have found her equally, if not more, interesting. Then we get Rosemary, who I think bridges the gap between Knife and Lyndon in terms of really, really strong, interesting female character and bit bland. Rosemary's probably in the middle. She still doesn't quite do it for me in the same way that Knife does, but she has curiosity, and I think her battle with her morals and of her superiority complex to some degree is really, really interesting, and I think it was good, if nothing else, to show a very, very different protagonist. She has just the right amount of self-awareness and self-doubt simultaneously to give her some really, really interesting self-reflection in spite of the larger plot of there is a war going on, which is good. Timothy, probably the main human character aside from Paul. He's alright, he's a bit boring, I just don't care a huge amount about him. Compared to Paul. I adore Paul. Paul and Knife are excellent characters, and they are excellent for each other, but Paul brings so much to the story. When Knife first sees Paul, she thinks he's sitting on a throne, and then as she gets to know him better, she finds out that Paul had very, very recently, within the first book, suffered from a spinal injury that left him in a wheelchair, and he is still coming to terms with the fact that he is now wheelchair bound, that he is now disabled. And for a book written in 2009, it handled it with such care and dignity and grace. There is no pity for Paul. No one pities him. He is struggling with a lot of self-hatred, but it is very, very clear to the reader and to Paul eventually that that is only his view of himself. And I thought it was just excellent, not least because throughout the next 3 books you also see Paul being just as capable as the other characters, even though he's in a wheelchair. Paul is a gem, essentially. And I should add as well, slight trigger warning for the first book, there is discussion of suicidal thoughts, and I was surprised by that when I reread that. I forgot how dark it actually was with Paul's injury and his feelings surrounding it, so tread lightly, especially because it is around the subject of a disability, and so I don't know how triggering / appropriate that is for people who have been in a similar situation to Paul, but yeah, just thought it was worth mentioning. And now I'm going to discuss just the 2 things that I strongly dislike about this series, which aren't actually huge, but equally are fairly fundamental parts. I don't know, like, I love this series, I really, really enjoyed rereading it, and I really think that I didn't give it enough credit when I first read it, but also these things irked me, and I would be remiss to not mention them. I'm going to refer to this issue as heterocoding. If we can have queer coding, we can have heterocoding, and that is a strong problem with these books. First and foremost, where are the gay characters? Just saying. In the oak where Lyndon and Knife live, there are only female fairies. You mean to tell me that not a single one of that all-female group of people are gay? Really? Not least because Knife has two mothers. Thorn and Wink are referred to as her mothers, and they really like each other, and they could have so easily been a couple. It makes me sad that these books came out in like 2009 rather than 2019, because if they had, I am positive that there would have been some gay couples. The opportunity is so easily there, and at the very least there would have been people clamouring to know why not. I think it's just a testament to when this book was written more than anything that that wasn't a part of it, but equally I'm just there going, come on, Thorn and Wink were such wives. Also, it feels like with the modern day, like, cottagecore movement, lesbian fairies are where it's at. You could make bank selling a story about lesbian fairies. And then the other problem of the heterocoding. Every single one of these three books has a female protagonist and a male protagonist and some kind of love story. And, like, there's nothing wrong with that. I actively enjoy Knife and Paul's plotline, but Lyndon and Rosemary, it served in no way. In no way did it serve their stories. It was a detriment to them, and I think it really just shows the push in fantasy stories for there being some kind of romance, especially some kind of sexual plotline, which fortunately there isn't in this, but could have been easily put in. It just bores me. Lyndon didn't need to have anything implied between her and Rob or her and Garen. It was like a really weak attempt at creating a love triangle that just petered out. I was glad that Lyndon and Timothy didn't end up together, because that would have been far too formulaic and far too similar to Knife and Paul's story. But then with Rosemary and Martin, and then Rosemary and Timothy, I was just like, this does nothing. This doesn't serve the plot at all. It is a detriment to Rosemary's character, and very simply the functional part of Rosemary and Timothy's relationship that is sort of needed for the plot could have been power of friendship, could have so easily been just a close friend, could have been her and Lyndon. It just did not serve it, and it just annoys me to no end that there seems to be a way to fit heterosexual couples into the forefront of any kind of story. It was so unnecessary. I will agree that it was necessary for Knife and Knife's plotline, and that it really helps the story. I enjoy it. But also these couples aren't written compellingly. Knife and Paul's relationship jumps from friendship to oh now they're kissing with surprising acceleration. Like, it doesn't quite fit. I really hate it when romance is somehow snuck into stories where romance does not serve the characters or the plot. And that is my one big issue with these books. Didn't need it. It just made it predictable and boring. It was very much love at first sight in that, oh, female character meets male character of a similar age. Equally, I would say it's a positive thing. If my only complaint about a story is that there are heterosexuals involved, it's pretty damn good, and I really enjoyed it. I'm sure there are people that would still find this story simplistic or boring, or that it would be childish, and I can completely understand that. I think I very much enjoyed this story as much as I did because I had already read it when I was younger, because I was familiar enough with elements of the plot, and because just that sense of familiarity made me enjoy it so much more on the reread. I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much had I picked it up for the first time this year. However, because I already liked it to a degree, I could get so much more from this story, and I really appreciate what it does and what it says, and just generally that it is engaging and interesting. And as I have said before, I'm not a big fan of fantasy, but this is it. This is it. This is fantasy that I can really get behind. Turns out all you need is fairies for me to like it. I think it's really good. I really enjoyed it, and I'm definitely keeping this on my shelf for another reread at some point in the future. I never gave this series enough credit, and now I think it is an excellent moral story as well as being a fucking fantastic fantasy story. But yeah, those were my thoughts. This was far too long, I am sorry. Thank you very much for watching this long rambly video about a series you've probably not read, probably don't care about. Probably I was too careful with the spoilers and so I haven't made it sound interesting enough, but never mind. Thank you for watching regardless. Please like this video if you did enjoy it, and if you want to see me talk about more bookish nonsense, feel free to subscribe. Thank you. I will see you next time. Book juggling. And thank you, laptop, for deciding to sleep with all of my notes. That makes it sound like my laptop's having an affair with my notes.